I don't know where that's coming from. Oh God, he's quacking at me! Got him. Got him. Right. Here's it. Go.
I like that.
This map because
It is very satisfying.
Got him. Yeah, we got it.
Nice.
Good awesome, man.
You too.
Welcome to Explosive Enterprises, and in our quest for a high-quality airsoft bullpup, we finally got our hands on a Northeast FAMAS. The obvious question is whether it's been worth the long wait, let alone the high cost, and funny enough, those are the same questions that were historically asked of the real thing. The Fusil d'Assaut de la Manufacture d'Armes de Saint-Étienne, or FAMAS for short, was developed in the late 1960s and early 1970s to be France's first domestically produced intermediate caliber assault rifle. As with many 5.56 bullpups in this time period, it was intended not only to replace France's standard issue battle rifle, the MAS 49, but also the MAT 49 submachine gun. Counterinsurgency operations in Africa during the 1970s highlighted the need for modern arms, and the French army took its time in developing the FAMAS to meet their requirements. The result was an odd but surprisingly sophisticated assault rifle designated the F1 and finally adopted in 1978. Internally, it is not gas-operated like most 5.56 rifles, but rather a form of lever-delayed blowback originally designed for the Hungarian Danuvia 43M submachine gun. With no gas system, the gun could have a simple bolt carrier and a free-floated barrel to improve accuracy. The use of delayed blowback also produced an exceptionally high cyclic rate of about 1000 RPM, so the gun was designed to allow both full auto for experienced operators and a 3-round burst for the conscripts who would also be called upon to use it. The magazines were designed around lessons learned from the AR family, with a capacity of 25 rounds to allow reliable feeding without requiring curved stampings, and yes, that doesn't quite line up with 3-round burst, but also nobody who actually shoots the thing seems to care. It's also interesting that the gun has no bolt hold open, and that it integrates a bunch of advanced features. Rifle grenade sights, integral night sights, integral bipod, it really is one gun that does it all. And while that did translate into a rifle that cost 2 to 3 times more than an M16 did at the time, ultimately spoiling any real possibility of mass export, the French army bought almost 500,000 of them and has used them with incremental modernization kits into the present day. While they are now being replaced with the HK416 as everything carcinizes into ARs, a 40-year lifetime for a service rifle is certainly respectable. And so we come to the Airsoft replica, a joint venture between the German retailer Gunpoint and the Taiwanese manufacturer Northeast to produce a replica of a French rifle for an originally Japanese sport which I, an American, am about to review. Truly, this gun is Mr. Worldwide. I've been anticipating this for a long time, and today we're excited to finally bring it to you guys for review, so let's get right into it with the externals. Starting at the muzzle, the splash hider is a birdcage style with an indexing notch for a bayonet. It also has a grub screw, and despite it looking exactly like the cheesy grub screws often used to secure airsoft muzzle devices, it is actually accurate to the real thing. Behind it is a steel outer barrel extension, much like the setup used on the VFC FAL and FNC we previously reviewed, and a spring-loaded collar that indexes into these grooves. This is a power control mechanism for launching rifle grenades, with faint range markings on the barrel extension, but it has no practical function in airsoft. The front sight post and rear sight post are both aluminum and protected by the plastic carry handle. All the plastic on this replica is the same glass reinforced nylon PA6, very tough stuff with a bit of flex, though the lower handguard has a glossier finish than the rest. The front sight is adjustable for windage and has a sliding night sight. On the real thing this would be a tritium vial, but here it's just paint. The rear sight is adjustable for elevation and has a wheel for selecting a 300, 400, or 500 meter zero. It also has a pair of apertures, both up for precision shooting, the narrow one down for CQB shooting, and both down for night shooting. Now this rail is a significantly modified EMG FAMAS rail, more on that later, but originally there was a combination night sight and flip-up grenade launching night sight with 75 meter and 100 meter positions. This sight was screwed into the carry handle with 2 tiny screws, but was also glued in place, so removing it requires very carefully chiseling it off the handle. Inside the carry handle we find the primary rifle grenade sight, which has 2 positions used in conjunction with the power adjustment on the barrel. Behind it is the charging handle, which is a plastic cover on a spring-loaded steel hook which grabs onto a steel tab on the outer barrel sleeve. Note that this is a reciprocating charging handle as it is affixed directly to the operating rod that connects to the bolt carrier. Below that is the integral bipod, which deploys by just pulling and rotating. This is not a very good bipod design. It has absolutely no adjustability or movement once deployed, and particularly for airsoft it probably won't see much use. The lower handguard has some grooves for grip and is marked 1 for semi-auto on the right and R for rafale or burst on the left. These correspond to the selector positions along with a middle safe position. The trigger guard is capable of swiveling to facilitate access when wearing gloves, and the separate pistol grip has an integral oil bottle storage, but only the first batch came with an oiler. Moving to the back of the receiver, takedown involves HK style cross pins which are steel. There's a removable plastic G-crest that can be freely swapped to the other side for left-handed shooting, which clips onto a plastic receiver cover, but the receiver itself is milled aluminum, which is accurate to the real thing. Here we find the primary markings, FAMAS 556F1, and a serial number. This serial starts with D, but it seems from the second batch onwards all guns sold in Europe instead have a GP serial prefix for gun point. Well, this is also a second batch gun, but it was sold in the Asian market, so it retains the D serial range which was used on some of the real FAMAS rifles. The bolt carrier is aluminum, but doesn't look appreciably different from the steel parts. Behind that, we have the secondary fire selection, which sets whether the R position on the safety produces 3-round burst, marked 3, or full auto, marked 0. There are steel sling swivels, 1 on each side, and a hard rubber butt pad with bumps for texture. Lastly, the top of this cover houses an internal spring-loaded buffer mechanism which is partially visible through a slot on either side. Onto the magazine, this is an aluminum body mag with basic gray anodizing and a plastic top cap. It weighs 335 grams empty, is full at 30 grams of gas, and holds 25 BBs by default, but can be expanded to 32 as we'll cover later. While at first glance this looks similar to a VFC AR mag, there's no cross-compatibility here with any existing AR mag, VFC or otherwise. That's the FAMAS, and as you've probably gathered, there is a lot going on here. Even before getting into the internals, it's clear that this gun's price can be partially attributed to simply how many parts go into it. I mean, the parts diagram is broken into 9 sections, and just the front and rear sights alone are 26 parts in total. On top of the sheer number of parts, there are also a mix of parkerized steel, both gray and clear anodized aluminum, glass reinforced nylon, and hard rubber, all requiring different manufacturing processes. The mix of finishes with proper materials gives it a nicely realistic appearance, and it feels appropriately hefty at a little over 8 pounds or 3.7 kilograms loaded, though as is typical for GBBRs, that is a bit lighter than its real counterpart. Externally, this is great, and our only other note is that the steel parts will need to be oiled or greased out of the box to prevent rust in a humid environment. So, let's take it apart. First, taking out the rear cross pin allows the receiver cover to slide off the back. I can now push out a captive pin on the fire control group and pull it out as a single unit, and push out a captive pin on the bolt carrier to disconnect it from the op rod and slide it out the back. That's all that's really needed for routine maintenance, but I can also knock out the other cross pin, then slide the carry handle forward slightly to unlock it, and pull straight up. You can see here that the standard sights are not attached to the carry handle. Instead, the front sight block is attached to the aluminum outer barrel, while the rear sight is attached to a steel sleeve. The lower handguard and carry handle also attached to this sleeve, which directly mates to the receiver, so the barrel itself is actually nominally free-floated. I say nominally because the carry handle does contact the front sight assembly, so it is possible to put pressure on the barrel, but in practice this has not had any discernible adverse effects. Both the front and rear sight posts are secured in place by grub screws on the underside, currently not visible because the lower handguard is in the way, so let's remove that now. To do that, I have to unscrew the sear engagement pegs from the transfer bar, and note that this very beefy coil spring connected to the rear one is what serves as the trigger return spring. Once those are removed, then I just need to drive out this cross pin tube, and that frees the lower handguard. This also allows the magazine release to escape its intended position, so pay attention to that on reassembly. Well, with the front end apart, those grub screws are now visible, and while we're here, let's take apart the recoil assembly. If I pull the charging handle back, it exposes an internal rod, which I will grab with pliers while unscrewing the nut on the front. At this point, if I release the rod, it will snap back into the tube, and you are now remembering that one scene from Black Hawk Down. Knocking out a pin and removing the cap at the rear then frees the rod and mainspring. This is a fairly stiff recoil spring, and it has a small shim to add a bit of extra tension. Okay, a couple of notes here. First, the nut is susceptible to unscrewing on its own, so we highly recommend applying thread lock on reassembly or if it shows signs of backing out. Second, because this is the chief source of friction in the design, we recommend a generous application of oil to the rod and spring. Grease will also work, but since this is a fairly closed system, it hangs onto lubricant well and oil works fine. And third, the exact orientation of the rod can affect friction in the charging handle assembly, so once reassembled, rotate it until the bolt carrier moves smoothly and doesn't hang up. As a rule of thumb, once the gun is broken in with some shooting, it should be able to snap fully into battery from as little as 1 inch or 2.5 centimeters. One more important point here is that the hook on the charging handle snaps across this lug every time the gun cycles. That both increases the amount of gas pressure required to get the bolt carrier moving because it has to overcome this locking mechanism, and also serves as a debounce mechanism because it locks the carrier forwards on the return stroke. Amusingly, this means Northeast and Gunpoint have produced an actual delayed blowback airsoft gun. Okay, now to extract the recoil assembly or the hop-up, it's necessary to take apart the entire front end. I'll be honest with you guys, I really don't want to do that because it's a long and tedious process that basically involves unscrewing every piece from the muzzle working back. And I know what you're thinking, hey, so what are you supposed to do about the stock hop-up? And the answer is nothing. This gun actually has a maple leaf bucking and barrel out of the box, with the inner barrel stabilized with multiple O-rings, and we've been impressed with the out-of-the-box performance. So if you do need to take it apart, we'll link Dingo's review and breakdown in the description, and he has a really good pictographic walkthrough on how to do it, as well as a video review of the gun itself in French. But we believe most airsofters will not need to change this. Just dial in the hop as you put a dozen or so mags through it, and it ought to settle in nicely. Back to lower handguard, the safety mechanism works by limiting the distance of the trigger pull. In safe it doesn't move, in semi-auto it moves halfway, and in full auto it moves all the way. So as we'll see shortly, this is essentially a progressive trigger like in the Steyr AUG or FNP90, where pulling the trigger partway fires one shot, and then pulling it further disengages the disconnector to fire full auto. This linkage, by the way, is a stiff piece of steel bar stock with very little flex in the vertical axis. How the trigger is designed is the biggest difference between purpose-built bullpups and bullpup conversions of existing designs, and this rigid linkage acting directly on the sears makes for a significantly better trigger pull than the usual coat hook on many conversions. One last thing, note the presence of this E-clip on the trigger axle keeping the linkage in place. The first batch guns do not have this, and it's possible for the linkage to work itself out. It won't come off the axle, but if it deflects far enough, full auto might stop working. Looking at the trigger pack, there's a lot going on here. First, most of this pack is steel and it has some gorgeous heat treatment on the sears, so we are not at all worried about wear and tear. Next, basic fire control is accomplished via disconnector, trigger sear, and auto sear, and these are all spring-loaded by plungers protruding out the bottom of each piece. The auto sear trips every time the bolt carrier goes into battery, simple enough. Then the main sear does not engage the hammer directly, but rather pulls the disconnector forwards to release the hammer. This allows the disconnector to pop up slightly, allowing it to slip off the trigger sear and pop back to arrest the hammer until the trigger is released and the trigger sear comes back and resets. In full auto, the trigger sear simply goes further forwards, preventing the disconnector from coming back far enough to engage the hammer. These are very small contact surfaces under a lot of stress, but because this is very hard steel, we see no discernible erosion from use, and just periodically squirting some oil in should be all it needs to keep working. That's the front half of the fire control group and everything relating to safe semi-auto. The rear half controls the burst mechanism, and it's kind of hard to see, but there is a giant lever running along the bottom of the fire control group. There's also a pawl at the rear, which is able to travel forwards every time the hammer is released. When burst is enabled, that pawl actuates a rotating shot counter mechanism, which after 3 shots permits that lever to pop up and stop the hammer. This only gets reset when the sear on the side of the fire control unit gets pushed backwards, which is done by the rear sear engagement peg. So there are 2 implications. The first is that if the gun is set to 3-round burst, it's going to be constantly winding and unwinding that shot counter a little bit every time you pull and release the trigger. That's probably not actually a problem, but to err on the side of caution, leave it set to auto unless you plan to actually use burst. The second, more important implication is that this system requires that the trigger return spring be able to overpower the burst reset sear. If the trigger return spring is replaced with a weaker one to soften the trigger pull, it may induce reset problems. Before getting into the bolt carrier, let's look at the receiver in stock. The receiver has a simple in-battery safety to interface with the auto sear and a valve knocker lock, plus the valve knocker itself. These are all steel and show minimal wear. The magazine well, on the other hand, is pretty rough, but that's entirely our doing. Out of the box, magazine insertion was difficult, but sanding a bit improved it tremendously. There was also some inconsistency with the magazines, but we'll get to that. As for the stock, there are 2 functional components here, a spring-loaded lever serving as a buffer, and a more straightforward short-stroke buffer. Now with this short-stroke buffer installed, the gun has a total bolt travel of 3 1/8 inches, or exactly 8 centimeters, and that is almost identical to the travel on a VFC, GHK, or Tokyo Marui AR. This buffer is also spring-loaded with a very stiff spring, which improves cyclic rate without making the recoil feel squishy. In this configuration, the actual authentic buffer is non-functional, as the bolt doesn't make contact with it, but the short-stroke improves recoil feel, snappiness, and cyclic rate, so we're going to leave it in place. If you really want to make your gun feel worse when shooting so that it feels better when you sit and fidget toy with it, you can just pull this buffer out, but we will be judging you harshly for it. The bolt carrier is aluminum and only about 100 grams, but keep in mind that when operating it connects to the steel action rod and everything there, so the actual amount of moving mass is significantly higher. To take apart the carrier, removing 2 screws at the back frees the return spring plug. Then it's just 2 long grub screws near the front, and note that when reassembling, these just need to be screwed in flush, not fully tightened. With those out, the nozzle and retainer come out the front, along with this loose piece to mimic the characteristic Mickey Mouse appearance of the FAMAS bolt face. If you're at all familiar with the TM-MWS or clones, this nozzle probably seems very familiar. Unlike the MWS, the piston cup at the back has an offset aperture and some internal geometry to keep it aligned, but the basic design is otherwise very similar. The nozzle itself then comes apart by removing 1 screw, and while the rocket valve is not adjustable by default, we reduced power by gluing in tubing in our usual manner. We did experiment with installing a grub screw to permit adjustment, but the problem is that it requires a very long grub screw to reach the cross screw, and that caused some sensitivity to alignment that ultimately manifested as inconsistent FPS. We also found a Japanese blog that stated boring out the nozzle inner diameter improved performance in their testing. We tried this, and we're not sure if there may be physical characteristics of dust or gas that make it behave differently, but with propane we saw no effect on recoil efficiency, siphoning, or any other metric at any temperature. Lastly, on reassembly, note that the captive pin is held in by a longer pin that gets pushed by one of the return spring plug retainer screws. Geez, that's a mouthful. So make sure to orient the pin correctly before fully tightening. The magazine takes some cues from VFC design with this plastic top cap that we found to be slightly inconsistently wide from mag to mag, so some had to be sanded slightly to smoothly insert in the gun. This cap comes off with 2 screws. That reveals a stop on empty system, which is not actually as complicated as it looks. Basically, there's a lever on the front that the follower interacts with, and this pushes on a plastic transfer bar, which in turn cams a valve transfer bar to either strike or miss the valve. From the design of these parts, it looks like there may have been significant iteration during development, as there's geometry here that isn't used. That's supported by the parts diagram, which is vague about the magazine, and also shows elements like a limiter tube that never made it into production. To access the reservoir, there's a giant screw on the underside concealed by the floor plate. Removing that screw reveals something odd. While there is a gasket at the base of the magazine to seal it, there's no seal on the screw, so it is actually just relying on the tension of the screw against the base plate to stay sealed, and while that sounds ridiculous, it does seem to work well enough that we haven't experienced any noticeable leaks. With the screw removed, the top section can come off as well, and this exposes the gasket used to seal the top. As we said on prior VFC reviews, this is a good system, and these fitted gaskets are much less likely to leak than O-rings. The reservoir itself is a big open space, and the gun will function fine on semi-auto up to 30 grams, or full auto up to about 25 grams, grams, though you risk siphoning past those values. I should also mention that the feed track fits 25 BBs, so this magazine has about 1 gram of gas per BB, which is a lot to work with. This BB capacity can be expanded to 32 by either cutting the follower short or substituting a 3D printed replacement, but keep in mind that fully compressing a spring will weaken it, and this system does rely on the follower spring tension for the stop on empty to work. Personally, I don't find the realistic 25 round capacity to be an impediment anyways, but it's your call. Now let's take out the output valve, because while it is a typical design, there's something I want to show you. The stop on empty parts fall apart pretty easily. I'll show you how to get back together in a minute. The valve looks pretty normal. There's an O-ring at the front and back of the valve to seal it, and an O-ring at the front of the valve stem, plus one at the rear. Here's the thing. It didn't come with this rear O-ring on any of the mags, even though there is a groove on the valve stem that fits it perfectly. Now, it's not unusual for a valve to lack a rear O-ring, as on a typical design it only needs to maintain a seal on the front of the valve at rest, but this does allow for gas to leak out when shooting. That has virtually no impact when using strong gas in warm weather, which is what most Taiwanese manufacturers are designing around, and even with propane at room temperature, the effect on efficiency and recoil is minor. But when you start exploring winter performance and ability to cycle at very low pressure, it has a huge effect. So we installed a 4mm outer diameter, 1mm cross-section nitrile O-ring, and we highly recommend it to all users, and especially anyone intending to use the gun below 68 Fahrenheit or 20 Celsius. To reassemble, after installing the output valve, start with the right side plastic transfer bar. Now take the valve transfer bar and insert its spring into the front, then slide that in. Use a thin tool to pull the arm up so you can see the hole in the middle, then insert the cross pin and get it through to the other side to mate with the plastic bar. Once that's in place, then just drop in the left side bar and you can stand it upright. Lastly, this slant on the back of the router isn't part of the original design, it's something we added with a Dremel and sanding drum. On the stock design, the nozzle coming forward seems to scrape across the hard edge of the router and distort it, causing inconsistent FPS and power loss after the first shot. For this gun, our added bevel helps the nozzle to deflect the router cleanly. While we're here, the magazine can be loaded without any adapter by just compressing the top BB slightly with a finger. A basic pistol adapter also works, or there's a 3D printable design that works excellently. And to enable dry fire mode, depress the follower, and then insert a spacer like a paperclip or plastic rod into this hole in the top. That will block the stop on empty mechanism. Overall, the internal design on the FAMAS is simpler than it might seem at first glance, with all the complexity of a stop-on-empty system offloaded to the magazine. All the operating parts are made to an impressively high quality, and the use of steel for contact surfaces and small parts means it has polished smoother with use and can be maintained with just a little bit of oil rather than needing our usual barrier grease to minimize wear. The decision to go with name brand bucking and barrel rather than something made in-house is also refreshing, as it reduces the likelihood that replacement will be needed. I will say that convoluted process needed to access the inner barrel is not ideal, and it's not clear why the hop unit couldn't be designed to install and remove from the rear. The magazines hold a lot of gas and incorporate a complex but reliable stop on empty. It's just baffling that they're missing an O-ring they were obviously designed for. Of course, it's the performance that matters most, so let's review controls and operation, and this is where the FAMAS gets weird. Magazine insertion is peculiar in that it's most easily done by inserting the magazine at an angle, and then it will naturally rock into alignment by pressing it. It isn't quite straight insert, but with a bit of practice it's not too big a deal. The charging handle is easy to grab and rack, no risk of slippage there. The safety is awkward. Because semi requires pushing the tab to the right, as a right-handed shooter, I need to use my left hand to disengage it. So like the AK family, this is less suited to dynamic safety manipulation, and more like safety off when the game starts, safety on when it ends. While the risk of a negligent discharge is at least mitigated by the long and heavy trigger pull. It isn't mushy or gritty the way many bullpup triggers are, it's just long and heavy, with an indistinct break and then a fairly long travel to reset. I've certainly shot worse, I've certainly shot better. Because this is essentially a progressive trigger, on full auto it will fire the first shot and then fire subsequent shots by pulling further. As discussed, there's no stop on empty, it just goes click when out of ammo. We've noticed that if the various screws on the magazine are not fully tightened, the gun may cycle weakly on the last shot or just puff out the BB without cycling. Not a functional problem because it does still shoot and you're out of ammo anyways, but something to be aware of. Lastly, the hop is adjusted by turning a wheel easily accessible inside the ejection port. And now for shooting. There's a decent amount of recoiling mass, and it's cycling very quickly against that short stroke buffer, giving a nice recoil impulse and snappy cycle. It's loud too, with a distinctive sharp report that is recognizable from across the field. For performance, in slow semi-auto on a 30-gram fill, we see about 150 shots before it stops reliably cycling far enough to feed. In strings of 25 with time to warm up, that translates to about 200 shots, or exactly 8 mags worth of BBs, certainly solid performance. This carries over to full auto, where on a 25-gram fill we get 5 full mags and then gas out on the 6th. Now for our usual ice water test, on a 30-gram fill we see about 40 shots before it starts sporadically short stroking. That's definitely not amazing, but note that that's with the O-ring added to the magazine valve, and in stock form it barely managed 15. Basically, there are a lot of factors here working against low pressure performance. It has a lot of moving mass, it has a strong recoil spring, it has an exceptionally strong hammer spring, and that locking mechanism on the charging handle. So it has to build up a lot of pressure inside the nozzle before the carrier can move at all. Even with that O-ring, this gun is not optimized for use with propane in cold weather, so we suggest switching over to stronger gas to compensate. On the chrono, after a high first shot, we see a noticeable drop in power over the course of the magazine, but on the field it hasn't proven to result in any discernible change in hop performance. As you probably gathered in the intro, the hop is accurate and consistent by our standards, except for one particular quirk. It is a maple leaf bucking, and like most non-silicone maple leaf buckings, it loses friction sharply as temperature drops. Normally you can just adjust the hop to compensate for the day's weather, but if an overfilled mag siphons and blasts rapidly cooling liquid propane through the hop, that will immediately chill it and cause subsequent shots to drop until it warms back up. So while the mags will work fine on 30 grams of gas as mentioned, if you want to avoid the risk of overfilling, just target 25 grams when filling at home, and then just give each mag a squirt of gas whenever you reload BBs, and it'll be fine. That's still more than enough for 6 mags worth of BBs per fill. Okay, so with all the dry technical assessment out of the way, we should talk about practicality and ergonomics, because this is most certainly an odd duck. Before that, I want to mention that if you are enjoying this video, please consider checking out our Patreon linked in the description, where we have technical content available to everyone and additional perks for our patrons. If there's nothing there that interests you, let us know in the comments what you'd like to see. And if you are already a patron, thank you. It means a lot to us. Anyways, back to the FAMAS. The first thing we need to talk about ergonomically is the handling. I like this. It balances over the pistol grip, which makes it very easy to manipulate one-handed, and that's genuinely helpful when grabbing objectives, prepping grenades, retrieving drop mags, anything else that takes the support hand off the gun. The overall length is also short even by bullpup standards, being comparable to a fully collapsed 11.5 AR. Particularly combined with the balance, this is great for working around cover and doorways, and I think would be perfectly usable in a CQB arena as much as outdoors. Well, except for, well, we'll get to that. Magazine changes are simple too. The bullpup layout takes some time getting used to, but the mag release is easy to hit. Mags will not drop free, but this is Airsoft, we're retaining them anyways. If I can manage to reload from a left side pouch while holding the gun left-handed and lying as flat as possible on my back to avoid getting shot, you can certainly reload under more normal conditions without too much trouble. The irons, on the other hand, are quite elaborate but difficult to use. It's not the height that's the problem, it's the hump for the buffer system which forces a forward-leaning posture. That's fine. I can't really criticize a rifle being designed for proper shooting posture instead of the Airsoft lean, but iPro and EarPro present additional difficulties. Using an optic alleviates this entirely and makes it comfortable to fire with a heads-up posture from either shoulder, even without switching the ejection board cover, but the height of her bore here is extreme and causes other issues. Now you might be thinking, oh, so it's really tall, like an AR with a carry handle optic? Oh no, the center line on this optic is almost 5 inches above the bore, over a full inch taller than the carry handle AR, and taller than even a Hydra mount. And it's sneaky because it doesn't feel that egregiously taller than the carry handle setup, but that's because on the FAMAS, the cheek rest is already elevated significantly above the barrel, so there's the height of the optic over the cheek rest, plus the height of the cheek rest over the barrel. So I mentioned that the gun handles well around cover, but having the optic so much higher than the barrel makes shooting over cover more difficult. It also produces a lot of vertical offset from point of aim, and at close range it's necessary to aim way above the target to score a hit. I'm used to holdover with carry handle ARs, but this is really a lot, and will take some practice to get accustomed to.
Got him!
For the mags themselves, these are unsurprisingly longer than 20-round AR mags, but shorter than 30-rounders. Depending on how tall a mag pouch reaches, it may be necessary to stuff a sock or other spacer in the bottom to get enough purchase on the mag, but otherwise these will fit in any pouch that accommodates AR mags, so no special gear is needed. That brings us to upgrades and aftermarket, and with this being such a boutique item, there are really just a couple of things to talk about. First, the optics mount itself. This is the EMG one, but it required belt sanding both sides to significantly narrow it to fit, and then we cut it short as we didn't need the full length. There are 3D printed solutions as well, but we wanted a metal mount if possible. Besides the concern of height over bore as mentioned, the carry handle is also not rigidly mounted to the receiver. While we haven't noticed any zero drift in use, it's theoretically possible that it could loosen up over time and need to be shimmed to remain tight, or applying pressure to the handguard via use of the bipod could shift point of impact. I do think an optic is the way to go regardless for this gun, as the irons are cool but I find difficult to use for the sort of quick CQB engagements we do in this hobby. The other piece of aftermarket is the FAMAS 3-point sling. You could probably just make a loop out of paracord to attach to the front sling lug, but as far as 3 points go, I don't actually hate this. I can have it in a convenient carry position in 2-point mode while getting enough slack to shoot from either shoulder in 1-point mode, and it doesn't spontaneously unhook in use like the H&K slings do. That's about it for this boutique item. Real FAMAS parts are hard to find and prohibitively expensive in the US, so we can't really assess them, and while Northeast is working on rail kits, and there is some promising community-made aftermarket for adjustable rocket valves, nothing has yet materialized as a turnkey product. Right now, what you get is what you get. So to summarize, this is a realistically steel and aluminum replica with good quality externals and exceptionally well built internals. It does not have provision for an adjustable valve, but it can be modified to a desired power level fairly easily. It has okay gas efficiency, but excellent gas capacity and a capable hop out of the box. It's loud, it's snappy, it recoils well, but it's annoying that it requires some magazine modification to perform at its peak. The ergonomics are weird but manageable, though the need to DIY an optics mount is keenly felt. Overall, this is a very well built gun that just feels a bit out of date in small respects, namely the lack of adjustable power and mediocre cold weather performance. Still, it both feels and performs great on the field, and particularly with the minor tweaks you've shown, this is a highly capable GBBR. The thing is, the retail price is an awful lot more than some other guns we've reviewed that offer comparable performance and nearly as good build quality. I don't think the price is unreasonable for what it is. After all, the FAMAS is a complicated design with a ton of bells and whistles, and here it's been executed to a high standard. But that does mean that to some degree, what you're paying for is it being a FAMAS. You'll just have to decide for yourself whether that's worth the price of admission. It's a shame that there aren't more modern gas blowback replicas on the market, but we will be reviewing another option fairly soon, even though it is a little different. For now, we hope you enjoyed this video, and thanks for watching.